Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Marxist Voice. My name is Adam Booth, the editor of socialist.net, the website of Socialist Appeal, the Marxist voice of labour and youth. And for those who aren't aware already, Marxist Voice is the YouTube channel and podcast of Socialist Appeal. And if you're not already, you should subscribe, follow, like all our social media channels on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and get our podcast on any major podcast provider, Marxist Voice. And normally in the show I'd be joined by some sort of guest from the labour movement, but tonight it's just going to be me, and I'm going to be talking about a quite scandalous report that's come to light in the last couple of days. It's an article in the Sunday Times, that Murdoch broadsheet, big business broadsheet, owned by the millionaire mogul, media mogul Rupert Murdoch. And this report, as the headline suggests, is quite a scathing investigation into the criminal errors, really, that were made by the Tory government in the weeks leading up to the pandemic arriving in Britain. And really, the conclusion is a very damning one. It's very, no uncertain terms is it revealed basically that Boris Johnson was asleep at the wheel. It said here that he missed 5 Cobra meetings, that he was missing in action, that vital equipment was not procured, that testing was not done, that plans weren't put in place, that scientists were, had their warning calls ignored. And all of this, the article concludes, as it says at the top, led to the deaths of thousands of people, unnecessary deaths. And really, I think we have to highlight what this report is saying. It's not saying it in the same terms that we would say, obviously, but in reality, what this is highlighting is murder. This is highlighting that the Tories, because of their negligence, because of their arrogance, because actually, as the report itself says, it's incompetence, austerity, and hubris that have led to the deaths of thousands of people. And that is murder, just as the mistakes made by the Tories led to the Grenfell disaster, murdering hundreds of people. Now we're talking about thousands. And it's no coincidence that you see time and time again the Tories putting our lives on the line because of their arrogance, because of their incompetence. They are the political representatives of the ruling class, of the capitalist class. They only care about profits. They don't care about lives. And what this report really reveals is just how far that fact went in the weeks leading up to the pandemic arriving in Britain. And even when it had arrived, the complete kind of apathy and inertia and indifference that the Tories showed at the top, because of their contempt for ordinary people, because of their concern just to keep profits going. And really, it's just a litany of fatal errors that are outlined in this report. As I said, it talks about the failure to procure protective equipment, personal protective equipment. And in fact, what you saw was that equipment was actually going in the other direction, to China. Meanwhile, austerity had dwindled British stocks in the NHS down to incredibly low levels. There was a huge scarcity of basic equipment like gloves and masks, and ventilators as well. There was not enough ventilators to match the predicted demand of the crisis. And so Boris Johnson finally, late in the day, appealed to big business to produce these things in what he called tactlessly the Operation Last Gasp, appealing to big manufacturers like Dyson, like Mercedes, and other Formula One companies to try and produce these vital machines. But what have we got? A few weeks on, none of these have seen the light of the day. All of the designs, the prototypes, have been ruled not to be sufficient. They don't meet the requirements needed to be used on the ground. And so instead, once again, we see how the free market has been unable to provide. And this again shows, Boris Johnson was just trying to get some nice little contracts for his mates like James Dyson, the head of that famous Brexit supporting manufacturing boss. And meanwhile, we have a severe shortage of these vital pieces of equipment. You also see in the report outlined talk of how there was almost no testing done in the run-up to the pandemic, even while the WHO was saying test, test, test. They say you must test in order to identify and quarantine people, in order to control the outbreak. But instead, we didn't do any of this. And one of the people quoted is the head of an organisation in Britain that represents private laboratories and testing facilities. And she said it wasn't until the 1st of April that the government got in touch about doing some mass testing. Meanwhile, in countries like Germany, they implemented such testing programs, and the result is today they have a fraction of the number of the deaths that Britain has. Meanwhile, Britain is going on looking like it's going to be the biggest in Europe in terms of the number of deaths, and second only to figures like seen in the USA, where Donald Trump has given even Boris Johnson a run for his money in terms of showing incompetence and a complete failure to get a grip on this crisis. Similar also to Bolsonaro in Brazil. All of these people, these reactionary leaders who play down the crisis, who played it down completely until it was upon them, and wasted valuable days and weeks that have allowed this virus to get out of control, exponentially grow. And I don't think it's a complete coincidence that you see these kind of figures showing such similar characteristics. In fact, if you look back at history, you can see that all kind of failed, rotten regimes have always seemed incompetent and out of touch when they face their final moments in the most decisive moments in history. You always see similar kind of personal characteristics, personal clownish behavior, buffoonish, kind of imbecile types coming to the surface. And Leon Trotsky actually described this very well in his History of the Russian Revolution, saying that at the end of the day, the reason all of these figures seem so out of touch and come across so arrogant and aloof and distant from the suffering that's going on around them, like Louis XVI and his spoiled, decadent wife, Marie Antoinette, who told the masses to go eat cake when they were starving out in the fields and the cities, just before the French Revolution came and lobbed off the heads of Marie Antoinette and her husband. Similarly, you see the same sort of ridiculous behaviour being displayed by the Tsar in Russia on the eve of the Russian Revolution. You see famously Emperor Nero fiddling while Rome burnt, as the proverb famously goes. And Trotsky says that all of these kind of figures ultimately reflect the same thing, which is the fact that if you defend a rotten regime, if you are the representative of a decaying senile system, then your actions will appear mad and ridiculous, and you will seem impotent in the face of these titanic events. As Trotsky says, quoting an ancient Greek proverb, whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. And that's why you see in this report, it outlined how Boris was not just absent from Cobra meetings, but was absent from government altogether. He wasn't even in London for weeks on end. He was busy, drunk on his December election victory. He was celebrating Brexit Day on the 31st of January. He was out in his countryside retreat with his pregnant fiancée, celebrating their engagement and their child on the way. Meanwhile, ministers back in Whitehall were given no directions. And yet there was these clear warning signs coming out from the scientific community saying if you don't restrict the virus, if you don't control it, it's going to spread through the whole population and kill hundreds of thousands of people. But yet the government, one of the reasons it didn't even bother with testing was it basically was planning for this. Ministers at the top were treating coronavirus just like another winter flu, where you do just let it rip through the population and a few people die, but you develop herd immunity. And this fated phrase has become infamous now as the government's failed strategy. They were trying to impose up until the last minute, when suddenly they were forced into a U-turn, a screeching U-turn, and forced to impose similar measures seen in Italy, in France, in Spain, where lockdowns were implemented. Why? Because suddenly modelling by scientists showed that yes, hundreds of thousands were going to die as a result of this herd immunity strategy, and even those numbers were too much for the Tories to stomach, and that's why suddenly the lockdown was brought in place. Even then, you saw how big business was allowed to get away with keeping construction sites open, running non-essential production, keeping retail going, which was clearly not necessary, putting workers on the line, basically putting their lives on the line. And again, the Tories, the representatives of big business, turning a blind eye to this unscrupulous behaviour of the bosses, which we've covered. in previous interviews and episodes on Marxist Voice. But now, suddenly, you see all of this scandal coming to light in the Sunday Times, and all the rest of the capitalist media singing from the same hymn sheet has chimed in. Keir Starmer up till now has been the invisible man, barely criticising the government, only rearing his head to offer up his services to be involved in some sort of national government. Suddenly he's also laying into the government. So that raises a lot of other questions. Why have the whole of the media, the establishment, has been so quiet on all of these things? They've been evident for a long time. Reuters actually covered similar kind of events and incidents in an article a couple of weeks ago. Even in Socialist Appeal and Marxist Voice, we were talking about these scandalous errors and mistakes that the Tories were making because of hubris and indifference and contempt for the working class. We were covering that right at the beginning, over a month ago, of this whole process. So what has changed? Why suddenly now has it come to light? Why the establishment now laying into Boris Johnson in quite scathing terms? Well, clearly the establishment has never fully reconciled themselves with Boris Johnson. He's always been a bit of a maverick, only looking out for his own interests ultimately, not the interests of the capitalist class that the Tories are supposed to represent. And this has led him onto a collision course with the Tories over the recent year, months and the last year. Figures like Dominic Cummings, this Rasputin Svengali-like figure in Downing Street, have waged war on the civil service, threatening to remove the blob, as they call it, in Whitehall and replace, establishment figures in the civil service with weirdos and misfits, as Dominic Cummings called them. And of course, Brexit was completely anathema to the ruling class. The serious strategists of capital did not want Brexit, let alone a hard one, and yet that's what Boris was celebrating on Brexit Day. He's lent on this rabid, hysterical layer of reactionary, xenophobic, nationalist types in the Tory party to get where he is today. And that's not just in terms of his leadership victory, but also his December election victory. And now, finally the ruling class is saying they need someone more serious. They need the adults in charge. It also helps now, obviously, that Labour, which up till now was taken over by the Corbyn movement, the completely unreliable elements as far as the ruling class was concerned. The Corbyn movement was in control of the Labour Party, no longer were the Blairites, these big business agents, in control. But and in that respect, Boris Johnson was always the lesser of two evils on behalf of the ruling class, as far as they were concerned. But now you've got Keir Starmer there, who's far more a safe pair of hands as far as the capitalists are concerned. And so he's the sort of person they can do business with. He's the sort of person who, as I said, would be more than willing to go into a national government and share out the blame and the burden and take on some of the pressures of this crisis. So what I think you're really seeing with this report is the fact that the capitalist class are wanting to clip the wings of Boris Johnson. They're wanting to try and reduce the influence of Johnson and Cummings and these kind of clowns and circus acts that have taken over the court and locked, as The Economist said in one of its articles, locked the sensible people away in the Tower of London. They want to get the sensible people back. The adults need to take over. Let the kids go back to playing around somewhere else. And so that's why you're seeing now really this open split in the government between two different wings of the capitalist class themselves. And on the one side also you see how this split is really also a reflection of the wider split in the ruling class over how to handle this crisis. There's one wing that is putting pressure on Rishi Sunak, on Michael Gove, the big business leaders who want the economy opened up, who want the lockdown ended as soon as possible. And they're putting pressure on one wing of the Tory party to open up the economy as soon as possible, to keep the profits flowing in as much as possible. And then on the other side, you've got Matt Hancock, the health secretary, who's been opportunistically joined by Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, and they reflect a wing of the ruling class that can see the dangers that lie ahead if the death rate spirals out of control, the radicalised mood that's going to generate, the hatred that's going to generate, not just towards the Tories, but the whole establishment, the whole system, and it could lead to very radical and explosive developments, and they therefore want to keep the lockdown going as long as it's necessary to try and reduce the death count, not for any real interest of ordinary people, but for their own political interest, which is ultimately the only thing, as I say, that really drives Boris Johnson. And so that's a split you're seeing in the ruling class, and in the process of that split playing out, you're seeing them attacking each other. Michael Gove and other figures are assumed to be the leaks for many of the allegations made in this Sunday Times article. So it really, what this has done, it's opened up a Pandora's box. It's quite dangerous from the point of view of the ruling class, because suddenly people can see in the light of day all the cesspit, all the horrible, disgusting, sordid mess that goes on at the heart of the ruling class, at the heart of the capitalist establishment. And that in turn will lead to radicalization and, again, an explosive mood, as I say, developing amongst workers and youth in Britain. There's going to be an inquiry. There's going to have to be an inquiry at some point, and that will be a day of reckoning for the Tories party, for Boris Johnson and these other murderers, as I say, whose criminal actions have put thousands and thousands of people's lives at risk here in Britain. And I think the ruling class can already see what's coming. There's a harbinger of big strikes and walkouts already taking place. In the labour movement, in workplaces where the bosses have put workers' lives on the line, where they haven't provided protective equipment. And these strikes and walkouts, as I say, they're a harbinger, they're a warning sign to the ruling class of the dangers that lie ahead, of the explosive developments that are going to lie in store. Because even when the lockdown ends, that's when the economic turmoil really starts. Rishi Sunak's promised wage subsidies, he's promised funds for small businesses and for the self-employed, but none of this is going to help at all. Instead, what the economists are predicting is a Great Depression style scenario, like in the 1930s, or even worse. And what happened in the Great Depression? You saw a massive swing, a massive radicalization to the left. And what you had was a Labour government, Ramsay MacDonald's government, elected in 1929, that by 1931 was pressured by big business, by the bosses, into forming a national government. Ramsay MacDonald crossed the aisle, joined the Tories, and formed a national government to carry out the programme of the bosses. That's what they want Keir Starmer, a very similar figure to Ramsay MacDonald, to do today. But he's got his own pressures. There's this Labour leaked report which shows all the scandalous sabotage of the right-wing bureaucracy in the Labour Party over the last 5 years that have prevented the formation of a Labour government, of a left Labour government, sabotage against the Corbyn movement that's angered, very rightly angered, ordinary activists. And imagine now if on top of that you get the formation of a national government where Keir Starmer walks in to protect basically the interests of the bosses. That's going to lead to an enormous radicalisation. What we need is not national unity. What we need is class unity in the face of the bosses. We need class unity to organise workers in the labour movement against the bosses' attacks, in order to not make workers pay for this crisis, but make the rich, make the bosses pay for this crisis. I think these are the kind of developments we need to expect, and I think the ruling class, who are also astute, can be astute anyway, and often will reach the same conclusions. They can see what's coming, just as we, the Marxists, can see what's coming, and they want to put in place the pieces whereby they're going to have a government that can protect their interests, that's going to be a stable government. But there will be no stability. There will be crisis after crisis, economic crisis, social crisis, political crisis. And within these developments, within these splits in the ruling class, you will see revolutionary movements building and occurring. This is what Leon Trotsky described in his History of the Russian Revolution. He said that every revolution always begins with a split at the top in the ruling class, because at the end of the day, the ruling class, as I said, is trying to defend an outdated, outlived system, and therefore whatever they do will be wrong. One wing will want to repress, the other wing will want to reform, but both sides will lead to ruin for the capitalists and to revolution for the masses. And that's the kind of perspective that we have to have in line, and that's the kind of perspective that Socialist Appeal has. That's why we're trying to build now. That's why we're trying to build a Marxist tendency in the labour movement of workers and youth who have been radicalised by events, who can see the crisis that's occurring and can see that the only way out is the socialist transformation of society. So if you agree with that perspective, if you want to join us in that struggle, please head to socialist.net/join straight away. Get in touch, and we'll put you in touch with other Marxist activists in the area, so in your area and across the country, so we can organise in Britain and internationally for the revolutionary developments that are on the cards ahead of us. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.